Hi, Graeme.
Hello, Bob.
How you doing?
Doing fine, thank you. And you?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Graeme Wood of The Atlantic. And you've lately become kind of famous, I would say, for being Graeme Wood of The Atlantic. You wrote this piece called What ISIS Really Wants that got a huge reaction, nearly unprecedented in magnitude, I would say. And it got some favorable reaction, some unfavorable reaction. Some of the unfavorable reaction came from me. I wrote a kind of critical piece on the New Yorker's website. And one thing I want to do is give you a chance to complain about my piece if you want. We'll get to that. If you don't want to, then I'll just start by complaining about your piece, but one way or another we'll wind up airing our differences. First, I wanted to ask, I mean, it has gotten an absolutely huge response, right? I think somebody told me that it has gotten, it's the biggest readership of any Atlantic piece in the internet era or something. Is that true?
Yeah, I guess there could be some essays by Thoreau or Emerson that have got more readership than this one.
I
But yeah,
doubt.
as
I
long
think,
as we've had
yeah,
clicks measured this way, I think that it's about as large a readership as we've seen.
yeah, wow. And do you have actual numbers? I mean, we're talking millions and
I,
millions of,
I don't know. I think the Atlantic might come out with some numbers, but I'm just a lowly writer. I don't count these things.
very modest of you. Okay. So, do you want to, for starters, do you have a short version of what the point of the piece, the purpose of the piece was?
Yeah, absolutely. So the piece in the March Atlantic was what ISIS really wants. And what it was an attempt to describe ISIS in terms that ISIS would recognize, to find out what the intellectual genealogy of the group was, and to talk to some supporters of the group. I won't say members. They in most cases would not cop to being members. In some places, it's illegal for them to say that they are. But to talk to people who seem to agree with the Islamic State about everything, and to compare what they say to what the Islamic State itself says, and to try to situate that in the jihadist movements that it has grown from. So I went to London, to Melbourne, Australia, and spent an unpleasant amount of time looking through ISIS social media to try to describe it, as I say, in its own terms, and find out where that leads us.
Okay. Were you surprised by the reaction to the piece?
I was. ISIS, it's pretty clear what ISIS thinks it is if you look at what it writes. It mass produces propaganda.
Right.
And it's not just the stuff that we see with Americans getting their heads cut off. There's lots of propaganda in many different languages, many fatwas written. And I was a little bit surprised by the reaction to the piece because a lot of that is easily accessible. And not just easily accessible to English speakers, I mean to Arabic speakers, but to English speakers, French speakers, etc. So, yeah, it was a little bit odd, I think, that a piece with what I would say is a modest ambition, that is to describe the group's ideology, that it had the reaction that it did.
Mm-hmm. Well, it did push buttons in ways that I would have said were kind of predictable. I mean, it got... my sense is that it was more embraced on the right and criticized on the left on balance, although I'm sure there were critics on the right and sympathizers on the left. But isn't that a fair... In terms of the people who energetically promulgated the thing by either clicking like on Facebook or saying this is horrible and spread it in that way. I mean, like the Fox News website, excerpted it and linked to it and stuff. And that didn't surprise me. Did that surprise you?
I disagree, actually. I think that there are certainly aspects of its reception that split along right-left spectra, but I did not find that overwhelmingly it was embraced by one side or another, or hated by one side or another. And even within Fox News, the longest spot on Fox News that I did of two was was taking a quite un-Fox News kind of view of the piece or view of the world, and was using the piece as an argument against invasion and intervention in Syria.
Okay, so let me at least provide the context for what my response was in the New Yorker, and then we can talk about that maybe, and maybe you can You can complain about my response, but the context was my concern that the clash of civilizations is becoming kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I didn't say that you personally embrace the clash of civilizations narrative, but I said that you, and also a very different kind of piece that Roger Cohen had written for the New York Times, seemed to me to provide some kinds of talking points for that would further sustain the clash of civilizations narrative. And although it's not, you're not responsible for how people turn what you say into talking points. You say what you think is true and accurate. I did say that I think there are times when journalists have to be very careful that what they say is strictly speaking true and defensible and isn't ambiguous and is as clear as possible. And that's where I kind of faulted you. So just to be clear, I don't think my criticism of your piece was in a way as extreme and kind of across the board as some criticisms were. But is that the way you took my piece, or?
Well, your piece was kind of lumping line together with this column by Roger Cohen, which did try to say that there is this clash of civilizations. I'm actually reluctant even to say that was his view, since he's not here to defend himself. But my piece was describing an ISIS view of a clash of civilizations that we should not fall into. So I think a clear distinction between my piece and your representation of the Cohen piece is probably a good place to start.
Yeah, I think I did clearly distinguish. There's a paragraph I could read that I think would make the distinction clear if you want. If you want to, maybe I'll get to it later. But because I had an email exchange about this with somebody at the Atlantic, so I pulled that paragraph out and I make clear that you would have to be taking a step beyond what you say to embrace the clash of civilizations narrative. It's not what you're doing.
I think you'd have to go quite a bit further from what I say. If one of those civilizations is Islam,
right?
My piece quite clearly says, I think this might even be a direct quote, that to call this a problem with Islam would be facile, even exculpatory. That there are many different types of interpretation of Islam. ISIS has chosen one. It's a highly brutal, literalist interpretation of Islam, and they're kind of on the hook for that. A lot of the piece, in fact, the part that I'm probably most enthusiastic about talking about is the part about Philadelphia. It's this long description of Abdullah Pocious, who's a Salafi imam in Philadelphia, who has theological objections to ISIS from a literalist perspective. So, the one thing I suppose I do take exception to in your New Yorker piece is the idea that my piece is suggesting, or could even easily be read as suggesting, that ISIS is the outgrowth of Islam. ISIS is not even the logical or routine outgrowth of literalist reading of Islam, as that section shows.
Well, okay, but you did, and I grant that you make a lot of these qualifications in the course of the piece. You make it clear that most Muslims don't buy into ISIS and so on. But you did say in a paragraph that I think was destined for repetition. It was set up. I think it was close to being the kind of billboard paragraph of the piece. But what you say is the reality is that the Islamic State is Islamic, very Islamic, and you italicize very. Now, that was kind of the main example of a couple of examples I trotted out, where I said I just thought you should have been more careful, because people are inevitably going to take that to mean maybe something other than what you meant. But for starters, that's going to be deeply offensive to a lot of Muslims for you to say this band of psychopathic killers is very Islamic. It's going to be embraced, if read out of context, by anti-Muslim bigots, of whom there are many. And that actually ISIS is going to like it. And in fact, I think a lot of ISIS supporters did do a lot of tweeting of your piece. Now, again, if it's true, if you can defend that claim, ISIS is very Islamic, then fine. I'm just saying you should be very careful and make sure you can defend every claim. And so I'm curious, what is your defense of the claim that ISIS is very Islamic?
Sure. It's actually very easy to defend, and it's something that anyone can look into. If they want to find out about ISIS, they can read ISIS's own words. Now, of course, there are plenty of aspects of ISIS. It's not fully explained by its religious ideology. But what is it looking into as its sources of justification, its rhetoric? Mm-hmm. And there's no question that the tradition that it's growing out of is this great, big, contradictory tradition that we call Islam. And it includes those particular texts, Quran, Hadith, and this fringe death cult version of its interpretation of these texts. Now, I can understand completely that Muslims would be offended by ISIS's holding up a banner and saying that we are the true version of Islam. But again, if we said that David Koresh is very Christian, that Mel Gibson is very Catholic, they too are part of very small fringe groups. There's no question, though. Of course, Mel Gibson is very Catholic. He's a fringe, weird Catholic with perhaps sedevacantist views. But again, there are, of course, ways that you can take 5 words of a piece and read them in ways that justify bigotry. But, if you read perhaps just 1,000, but certainly if you read all 10,000 words of the piece, I think you'd find a very different message.
Well, okay, but in the modern world, we know that a piece is going to get dissected. And again, I'm not even holding you responsible for literally, out of context stuff, but I think you should be able to defend at least the phrase itself. And so I'd like to push you a little further on that. So you're saying, as I understand, first of all, I don't think many people would say David Koresh is very Christian. You seem to think that would be a fair thing. I think most people would say that's an aberrant cult. It's not very Christian. You might argue that he's Christian. He believes the basics. Jesus is the Son of God, and so on. But I first of all would say I don't think many people would agree with you.
Well, I think that you can say that something is an aberrant cult and also be very ex-Christian, Jewish, Islamic, and that's something that we can discuss. Okay. There are many Muslims who would say the opposite and have said the opposite in complaining about my piece and said that, look, this is not a mainstream group. It's rejected by the mainstream. It doesn't have scholars on its side who are considered serious by almost any Muslims who aren't part of the Islamic State.
Right. And
they will say, sure, this is not an Islamic group because it's rejected by the mainstream. But again, do we allow the mainstream to define what groups spring out of what tradition, what the sources of inspiration are, whether they have the same textual sources of authority? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, no, I'm not asking you to give them veto power on whether we call them Muslim or Islamic. I'm just saying the term very has a meaning. It implies a relative comparison. If you say he's a very good football player, it means he's better than some of the others. There's something he has that's different from and more than the others. So in what sense, what is it ISIS has that is kind of more than a lot of other Muslim groups or interpretations?
Sure. There are lots of Islamic groups that I would not say are very Islamic in the same sense that I would say that ISIS is very Islamic. There are, in fact, most Muslims have sources of authority that they wouldn't attribute to the Quran, the Hadith, and the early actions of the Prophet Muhammad and his, his companions. The Islamic State looks pretty much just to those things. They have other motivations too, but when they describe what motivates them and the sources of authority that they think are real, they look exclusively to those things. I think if you said that a Christian group looks only to the Bible and it basically just shuts out any other discussion of anything except for biblical text, then I think you'd be fine in saying that that's a very Christian group, even if it leads the ones who follow that particular ideology to have weird views that are rejected by almost all Christians.
Okay, so to take an extreme example of what you're talking about, in the book of Deuteronomy, which is not just part of the Hebrew Bible, but part of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, God advocates genocide. He says if cities near you believe in the wrong gods, you should kill every living thing, men, women, children, livestock. Yeah. Now, if somebody Jewish started trying to commit genocide and said, well, it's in the Torah, would you say that because they advocate genocide, they are very Jewish? Would you have put it that way?
Yeah, it's absolutely. So, for example, Baruch Goldstein, who massacred 29 Muslims at prayer in Hebron. Uh-huh. There is in 1994. This is a very good example. He's rejected by the state of Israel, rejected by a vast majority of Jews. Would we say that he is very Jewish? Absolutely. He was working directly out of text, trying to reenact Purim or whatever. And yes, to say that he's very Jewish, I think would be a perfect description of his actions.
So he's
now,
more Jewish. So the mass murderers are more Jewish than Jews who aren't mass murderers by your account.
Well, it's not the fact that he's a mass murderer that makes him more Jewish.
Well, okay, but this mass murderer and somebody who advocated genocide on the basis of Deuteronomy would be, in your book, more Jewish than a peaceful Jew.
If you're spending a huge amount of time looking at the book of Deuteronomy, and that's the only thing that you think is important in figuring out what the right thing to do in this world is, then I'd say you're pretty Jewish, yeah. Now, to say that, does that mean that you're also the best kind of Jew? Absolutely not. Does it mean that you're a representative of Judaism? No. It's a particular type of literalism that ISIS represents, and that's a very Islamic version of literalism. It's a particular, really peculiar interpretive strategy that they have. And, many Muslims and many Christians and many secular people who are legal scholars would say that their kind of literalism is incoherent or unserious. That's fine. I don't really have any problem with that. But again, what are the sources of authority they're looking to? Are they looking to them sincerely, carefully, as scholars? Yeah, they're doing that, and that's making them very Muslim in my book.
Okay, so that's an answer I hadn't expected. So you would say then that ISIS is more Islamic than law-abiding, peaceful Muslims are? More
Islamic in a particular sense, yeah. If you're a law-abiding, peaceful Muslim, and there's plenty of other sources of authority or argument that you would accept, and there's nothing that's to demean a law-abiding, peaceful Muslim's practice of his religion by saying that. It's just saying that he's a normal person. If the only thing that you're looking to, that you use to justify what you do, is the Quran, then I'd say you're pretty Muslim. Yeah, it's a weird way to be Muslim, but it's still very Muslim.
Well, if it's a weird way to be Muslim, then almost by definition, it's not very Muslim, right? I mean...
Oh, I don't think so. No, not at all. I think that if you say that these are my sources of authority and I look into them exclusively, it means that you're a fringe Muslim. That doesn't mean you're not very Muslim.
But you see, I think this actually flies in the face of the view of your kind of star witness, Bernard Haeckel, at Princeton, he's the main intellectual you kind of bring out, and a lot of what he says accords with what you say. But one thing he says at one point is Islam is, it's what Muslims do. It's how they interpret their texts. Now, that's a particular definition kind of religion. And it's a non-essentialist definition, which I like about it. It's not saying there is this kind of heart of Islam that has remained there since the founding. He's saying, look, whatever, any religion has many manifestations. They change over time. At any one point, there are different people doing different things in the name of religion. So all you can say is that religion it's what Muslims do. Well, if you accept him as an intellectual authority, and that's your definition of religion, then it seems to me the only way to look at the question of what very Muslim means, if that's the definition of Islam and what it means to be a Muslim, is like, well, what do most Muslims do? Or what have most Muslims done over time? And by either of those criteria, it makes no sense at all to call ISIS very Muslim, and I don't think Bernard Haeckel would call them very Muslim. Do you see that contradiction kind of within your piece?
I see what you're saying, and I disagree with your interpretation of what Bernard Haeckel says. When he says that they're very Muslim and that what Islam is what Muslims do.
He did not say, did he say they're very Muslim? Bernard Haeckel?
Well, I don't want to put words in his mouth. So
I don't think he did.
If I have not quoted him saying that they're
I'm pretty sure he wouldn't, but go ahead.
Then I won't say that he says that. But again, what he's describing, and the reason his words are so important in my piece, is that it's establishing that this description is simply that. It's a description. It's not a normative claim about what the best type of Muslim is. That's something that Bernard Haeckel, I think, would certainly shy away from as an academic and as a non-Muslim. And it's also something that I would shy away from. So when you're describing someone as, again, we're talking about two words in the piece here, but I understand why they're important to chew over in great detail. When we're describing someone as very Muslim in this context, it's not to say that they're the best kind of Muslim. It's to say that in this tradition of what Muslims have done historically, what Islam has consisted of, in according again a huge, vast, contradictory tradition, to say that they're very Muslim is to say that they're squarely within that tradition and they're not picking from other traditions and sources of authority. And I think he would agree that they, by and large, are doing that.
I don't think he'd agree that it's fair to call them very Islamic or very Muslim.
Well,
that flies in the face of his...
Here, I think. I know he's been a guest on Blogging Heads before, so please ask him.
I think I can assure you he doesn't talk that way. And again, I'm not. The point isn't that he wouldn't be normative about it and say it's a good thing. Obviously, he's not saying ISIS is good. You're not saying ISIS is good. I'm saying to call ISIS very Islamic, to call anything very Islamic. Well, certainly to call him any minority interpretation very Islamic, it flies in the face of his way of defining what religion is, which is a pluralistic definition, which says it's whatever people do. If that's what you mean by religion, you can't say that what almost no Muslims do is very Islamic. That's my point.
Well, there are things that Muslims could do that I think would be, even if they are Muslims, then it would be in a really marginal, strange case. But I suppose if there were Muslims who believed that their religious practice required drinking vodka and eating blini and worshipping in Orthodox cathedrals, then I would say that they in some way are not very Muslim, even though they're Muslims who are doing these things. So that might elucidate a bit the point about ISIS.
But that would be pointing out something that not many Muslims do and flies in the face of prevailing contemporary interpretation and flies in the face of what the interpretation of a text has always been. Sure.
It would be a very odd way of being Muslim. It's true. And it would be
you could say that's not very Muslim. Sure.
And, ISIS is very odd in its own ways, and it's out of tradition in certain ways, but it's looking for authority, and it's looking for a particular kind of past of what the 7th century was. And, we can talk about whether their version of the past is a fantasy or not. I think that's a very interesting discussion that Heikel in particular would be able to suggest sources on. But again, the question of whether they're looking into a particular tradition, drawing inspiration from Islamic texts, that's not really up for debate by anyone right now, although it was consistently and relentlessly denied in discussions of ISIS in recent months.
Yeah, well, by politicians and so on, which I understand. I mean, my own view is, again, kind of pluralistic. It's like, look, if people say they're Muslim and they believe the basics, there's one God and so on, who am I to say? So I don't go around denying that ISIS is in some sense Muslim or Islamic. It was the very Islamic thing that got me. And I would say I don't deny that they ground what they do in the text, but it's a very it's two things. It's a selective reading of the text, and it's a reading that they don't allow to be influenced by the entire interpretive history in Islam, which, according to pretty much all other Muslims, is decisive, is important.
You're quite right. You're quite right. Yeah, and that's their whole point, really, is to say that we can and should delete most of Islamic scholarship in history.
Right.
If they're talking about the last 1,000 years, gone, and most of what we think of the triumphs of Islamic civilization, they either downplay or actively repudiate.
Right. So, there are 4 legal traditions in Islam. They all have, I think, as a bedrock principle that, there is this kind of accretion of interpretation. It's a little bit like the law where precedent matters. And you're not allowed to reach conclusions without giving due consideration of what scholars have said. They reject all of that. And that goes back, you're right, I think probably at least a millennium, and that leaves them free to pick and choose. So, for example, probably the most famous, jihadist verse in the Quran is probably the sword verse, and it's true. It says, it's translated often as saying, kill the infidels wherever you find them. It actually says kill the polytheists wherever you find them, but it says that. But then later it says, if they ask for asylum, grant it so they can hear the word of God, and then let them go to their place of safety, because they are ignorant and don't know, they can't be, whatever. And ISIS is going to ignore that. But it's important to understand that when they anoint themselves as the ones who pick and choose, what they're going to pay attention to in the Quran, They are, again, defying the entire history of Islamic legal scholarship, which is the source of legal authority in Islam. And that's why I think to call them very Islamic when they're denying the very foundation of the whole system is I guess I'll let this rest, but you understand why
I hear you. I hear what you're saying. I think it's very important to look in detail at their interpretation. So if you point out a verse to some of the supporters I've spoken to, and these are in some cases well-known, I hesitate to call them dissident. They're really loudmouths who are leaders of a small goon squad in London. And if you ask them about particular verses, such as the requirements that sanctuary be given, that surrender be accepted, they'll have answers to that, and their answers will not be satisfactory to most Muslims. But I think it's very important that we look at their precise ways of justifying themselves. And for example, they would say that yes, we are required to give sanctuary and to accept surrender. However, there's also this verse that says you can't accept surrender once the person is taken into your captivity. And again, it's not that they're rejecting one verse. It is that they're rejecting one verse in favor of another, but they're also accepting a particular verse as scriptural authority, and they're pointing to it, and sure enough, it's there.
Sure, there's a lot of stuff there to choose from, good and bad. They're making their choices. I'm just saying that to call them very Islamic is like calling somebody very Catholic if they don't respect the authority of the Pope, which I don't think anybody would think is right. ISIS is rejecting the entire authority structure within the entire structure of intellectual authority within Islam.
Well, ISIS is rejecting certainly the mainstream of authority within Islam. There are traditions that they arise from that, again, are extreme minority traditions that have been rejected, have been considered antiquated, to say the least.
The big guy is Ibn Taymiyyah, this 13th century guy who was marginal. He was considered reactionary extremist, marginal at the time. He was marginal thereafter, and he did the same thing of basically denying the the very idea of like respecting the accretion of opinion within the legal traditions. So they can point to somebody in the 13th century, but he was never anywhere near the mainstream. He never has been, and he was, forgotten for centuries thereafter, basically. So,
well, he's still a scholar who would be claimed by Salafis of every type.
Right. So in the 18th century, he got his little revival, but the Salafis
he's had a revival, right. And there are Muslims right now who that this imam in Philadelphia, I would suggest, might be one of them, who would say that Ibn Taymiyyah is an important scholar, and also to say that the interpretation that we should accept of Ibn Taymiyyah, as well as of the actual texts of the scriptures of Islam, is not ISIS's. But again, we're talking about traditions within Islam, even if they're minority traditions.
Okay, and I guess. Was one other point kind of before we proceed to other subjects. Another point I was critical of in my piece. There's a point where Bernard Haeckel is kind of dismissive of the idea that Islam is a religion of peace. And what he says, that's actually when he says what I previously quoted. He says, is it, this idea that Islam is a religion of peace, he says, as if there is just one Islam, this thing called Islam. Islam is what Muslims do, how they interpret their text. That's where he gives you his pluralistic definition of religion. Now, I read that, and I kind of inferred that one thing he meant was that there's no such thing as a religion of peace, and that is indeed what as he fleshed out his ideas in an interview he subsequently did with Think Progress, that was an implication of his thinking. And I thought, it's so explosive to just toss off a dismissal of the idea that Islam is a religion of peace, because there's so many people, so many Muslim haters, and so many people, with, in my view, extremist ideas about appropriate policy, who want to hear that Islam is a religion of war. I thought you should have been totally clear that that's what he was saying. There's no such thing as a religion of peace, given the way I define religion. So I'm just wondering, did you understand that was the implication of what he was saying? And did you think about spending a sentence or two saying that?
I let him spend a sentence or two saying that with the bit that you already quoted. He says, as Islam, perhaps you have the quote in front of you, but he says, Islam is a religion of peace. What nonsense. As if there's only one Islam. Islam is what Muslims do and what their texts say. It's clear that that's how he is qualifying the sentence, Islam is a religion of peace. And, substitute Christianity, it would make exactly the same sense. To say that Christianity is a religion of peace, again, it's a very strange kind of category error to make, to say that. And yet, again, it's relentlessly said that Islam is a religion of peace. It's, again, just to say that this is a tradition that is complicated, like almost all religions are. So when he says it that way, yes, if you read just the first part of the quote as quoted in my article, then that could be awfully confusing. If you pause a breath to take the rest of the sentence, then I think it should be pretty clear, as it was to you.
Well, it wasn't me, but I've written a whole book. I write about this stuff. I have said 100 times in my life, there's no such thing as a religion of peace. So it was easy for me to pick up on what he meant. But I just think it's safe to say that of the many millions who read this piece, a lot wouldn't. It seemed to me, in fact, kind of, you had to really kind of stop and ponder it. And I was just wondering, what you didn't have him say is what I mean is there's no such thing as religion of peace. But anyway, that's a question. You didn't think that was necessary.
I didn't think it was necessary. And, if I had paused and then had a couple sentences saying, yes, this is a particular type of this is a view of religion that says religions are big pluralistic things, and that to describe one as a religion of peace is inevitably going to be simplifying, then I think I would have had a fuller description of what he was saying.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, one thing you say in the piece, and you've said is one reason you got into all of this is that there's value in doing it, and I should say, if my New Yorker piece had been like a review of your piece, I would have had the obligatory paragraph where I said there's a lot of interesting stuff in this, and there's stuff I didn't know, and all of that. So I don't want to deny that it's a worthwhile read at all. I don't, though, think that, and I don't think it's like totally without value in terms of practical implications. But given my worldview, I actually don't agree that it sheds a lot of light on appropriate policy, and I think it ignores the things we need to focus on to make our policies appropriate. So anyway, why don't you talk a little about what you think the practical value of getting into this stuff is?
Sure. Well, first of all, we need to find out who these people are, what they think. This, of course, doesn't describe how they arrived at these conclusions or what the background is of that. And as you probably remember in my piece, I say, look, if you don't discuss the social changes, the political changes, the invasion of Iraq, these things, if you don't talk about them, then you will not get a full impression of what ISIS is. But again, finding what their ideology is and how they present themselves, and then how to present a counter-narrative to figure out what options we have to kind of baffle their message before it gets to more people, I think is very important. And then the other aspect of it is the way that they describe what they're doing is as following a particular battle plan. And it derives from this ideology, it derives especially from their belief about how the apocalypse will arrive. And I'm not suggesting that they're going to be automata and that they will just follow this script to a letter. But having a sense that this has been, both in the way they present themselves to the outside and the way they talk about it to themselves, a very important a criterion for how they act, and a very important aspect of their planning, I think, is important to know, especially if we're going to war with them. And that's the final bit. If there's going to be an invasion, and I hope there is not, then we should understand how that's going to play. We should understand what they think, what they're going to say about that, and we should understand that if we do it, we'll be doing exactly what they want. So I think any time we're putting human beings at risk of death, and every time we're putting American soldiers in a position of invading a country, we should understand very well exactly what the enemy consists of. And part of that is understanding their ideology. So that's what I was trying to describe.
Yeah. And you did say that by and large you thought ground troops would be a mistake. You seem to be fine with the bombing that's going on, but you thought that ground troops would be going too far. far, I mean, I wouldn't say you were totally dismissive of the possibility. You outlined some scenarios under which it might make sense to rethink the ground troop issue. So, for example, if there's a merger between Al Qaeda and ISIS, if ISIS was on the verge of storming the city of, is it Erbil? I don't know how you pronounce it.
Erbil, yeah.
So you think there are some circumstances under which ground troops, you're leaving that open as a possibility, but and there I would disagree with you, but I don't think anybody really cares about that. But I think it's good that you emphasize that you are ground troops would, all other things being equal, affirm their narrative.
Yeah, I think ground troops would be a terrible idea in the current state of things. Mm-hmm. Now, there are 8 million people living under the control of the Islamic State, and I wouldn't want to underemphasize what a catastrophe that is already. If they were actually in a position to overrun the city of Baghdad or Erbil, we would be talking about, I think, a genocide, to say the least. And that's, to say the least, genocide. This is a very, very bad situation, and ground troops might be the way to respond to that. But in the meantime, yeah, if we tried to invade Raqqa, I think we would be paying a huge price for a significant but nowhere near compensating gain.
Yeah. You also note, and again, this is a place where I thought you were kind of pointing to the virtues of a possible intervention, but maybe I was overreading you. But you noted that there is this town called Dabiq.
Dabiq, yes.
And it plays some big role in their apocalyptic scenario. I don't think it's the very culmination of the apocalypse, but it's basically they win some decisive battle there, according to ancient scriptures or something. And you said, well, if there was this big to-do there, and we won and they lost, that might be the end of the caliphate. And I was just thinking two things. First of all, I'll bet one is any sustained battle is going to be the biggest recruiting magnet for them in the history of the world, right? I mean, if there's like a big thing going on in that town, I would be reluctant to try to engage them there at all for that reason. The other thing is, it seemed to me that they would be able to wiggle out of that. I mean, because after all, rhetorically, they would be able to wiggle out of a loss there. Because after all, there's plenty of time left. And in fact, one of the more reassuring things I discovered in your piece is that by their own account, the apocalypse doesn't happen under this caliph. In fact, we're still 4 caliphs away. Like they consider this guy, al-Baghdadi, the 8th legitimate caliph. And it's not until the 12th caliph or something that the apocalypse happens. I was sleeping better after hearing that, so like they're not expecting the apocalypse tomorrow. But anyway, that would seem to me to make it very easy for them to, if they get, I would think that would itself be a big recruiting boost for them, even if they got beat.
Yeah, I agree, actually. I think it would be a terrible idea to meet them on the field of battle in Dabiq, Syria. I mean, after all, Dabiq, Syria is a place of very, very little strategic importance. It's not even actually that important in most interpretations of hadith. It's really something they've dug out of the footnotes and have said, look, there's this mention of a big battle in Dabiq. They're not even really sure that they're going to win it, So just to show up there and fight them, I think would be an enormous recruiting magnet. They could very plausibly say, hey, this is a place that doesn't matter at all, and yet, look, it all happened exactly as we said it was going to. So I think showing up there and expecting them to lose in the long term, even if they almost certainly would lose militarily on the field of battle, I think that would be a truly silly thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, don't you think the bombing itself has some of the effect that you find worrisome about a ground invasion, right? I mean, it is pitting the U.S. against them, which plays into their narrative.
Yeah, in some ways, you can't avoid it. We are opposed to them because, they practice slavery and genocide and all sorts of things that we don't like. Now, bombing, it's a little bit better optically. It's not something that I think is likely to, first of all, I don't think it's going to have nearly the effect that we would like it to have. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's going to be bad. We're going to kill a bunch of people, and they're going to be able to truthfully show that American bombs have killed kids. So that's bad news, and we certainly ought to think about what the effects are going to be.
Yeah. And that kind of leads to what my own view is about the most productive way to look at this, and why I think your piece, while interesting, I didn't think by my light shed a whole lot of new powerful light on what we should do, which is just that it seems to me we already knew, or it seems to me it should have been obvious to anyone. These people most of them seem to be true believers. There may be some fakes in there, but they seem to be true believers. They seem to be in the grips of genuine religious fervor. They seem to be successfully convincing recruits that they are religiously legitimate. And again, the fact that they want to convince these recruits of that is one reason I would rather be careful about calling them very Islamic, because that's what they want to say they are. But it seems to me that once you know those things, the most productive question is, what puts these recruits in a frame of mind that needs them to need religious fervor of a violent kind? Okay? That's what's attracting them. We already kind of knew that was what was attracting them. And so I would like to, I know what I think some of the answers are. It's like, because I know what their propaganda says. It talks about drone strikes in other countries. It talks about the fact that we invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. And those things you really, I think, don't mention per se. You do note that the Iraq War created space for ISIS to flourish, which is certainly true. But in terms about how our ongoing interventions, or for that matter, Israel-Palestine and America's role in seeming to countenance Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, you don't mention those things as kind of ongoing contributors, ongoing kind of enrichers of the jihadi recruiting pitch, right?
Yeah, that's right. I didn't spend a lot of time on drone strikes, and partially that's because ISIS actually doesn't spend that much time talking about certain, particular drone policies, for example. I think the most useful thing to look at to find out what ISIS thinks motivates people is to look at their own propaganda in Davik magazine. And there's a whole lot of stuff in there about religion. There is definitely stuff about the support of Israel by the United States. But it's a pretty complex kind of pitch that they're making to people. And I agree with you, actually, that what we need to do is figure out, why is this appealing? Well, what is it that's made people say that the reaction to either political disenfranchisement in Iraq or Syria, or maybe just social alienation in London, why is it that people turn to this as their way of fighting back? And that's a really interesting question. I agree that it's worth looking into. But again, just finding out what the content of these beliefs is I think the first step.
Okay. Now let me ask you just a couple more questions. One is on this. As you may have noted, I'm paying a lot of attention to way particular phrases are received in various corners. You probably think I'm paying too much attention to that, but in particular, the kind of billboard phrase, ISIS is very Islamic. I'm wondering if, and again, to be clear, I'm not saying that anything you feel is strictly speaking defensible and true that you should refrain from saying. I'm just encouraging care. But I'm wondering, did you at any point in writing sentences like that, like the Islamic State is very Islamic, did you think, well, there are going to be Muslims offended, ISIS is going to like this, some bigots are going to like it, but it's worth it in the scheme of things? Or did you just not think in those terms?
Well, certainly I have no hope of satisfying bigots. I have no hope of satisfying Muslims who wish to deny that there's any scriptural basis for what the Islamic State does. On the question of whether the Islamic State would like it, you're correct to note that the Islamic State supporters have tweeted out my piece. I think you're actually mistaken, though, if you think that the Islamic State that they would prefer to be called. I think that they would prefer to be called not Islamic, and that's my read of their propaganda and the way that they sell themselves to Muslims. And here's why: if they're called not Islamic, they can very readily say, "No, we're Islamic in the following ways," and obviously so. We're pointing to these particular texts, and if others are calling us not Islamic and are not grappling with the details of what we believe, then they're co-opted, they're hypocrites, and they're clearly wrong. And so the people who are inclined to think that the Islamic State is something they should support, they'll look into this and they'll find claims that the Islamic State is just a bunch of nihilistic psychopaths who are perverting Islam or incorrectly quoting the Quran. And they'll discover that those claims are false. And they'll think, I wonder what else the Islamic State is right about.
But surely you're not saying that ISIS doesn't want to be thought of as Islamic, and indeed, in some sense, very Islamic, right? I mean,
they want to be called not Islamic by
I see.
By mainstream Muslim scholars.
They want Obama to say they're. You think they want Obama to say they're not Islamic?
Oh yeah, I think definitely that's the case, and many of them have said exactly that to me.
Okay, but their pitch to recruits is, we are Islamic and we are very Islamic. Indeed, we are essence of Islamic, and virtually all the other Muslims you see are just wrong about what Islam is. Yeah,
that's right. That their pitch is, of course, that they're very Islamic, and when their pitch is also that when the various scholars who say that we're wrong speak, they're speaking in politically motivated ways, etc., etc. They're liars, and if they can show ways in which that's true, then it doesn't take very much for them to undermine in their propaganda mainstream Muslims and also politicians. So I think there's obviously different ways that different messages are read by different people, but don't assume too quickly that calling them un-Islamic annoys them. I think they really like it.
Do you understand why Obama thinks that, given the fact that he's president and is speaking in that role, that there is some upside to saying they're not Islamic?
Oh yeah, I don't actually criticize Obama for the way he speaks as president. There are all sorts of good reasons why he should assure American Muslims and Muslims everywhere that this is not a fight with Islam. And the quick way to say that as president of the United States is to say that ISIS is not Islamic. But again, it's not just the president of the United States who's saying this. This is a view that's relentlessly pushed, that the Islamic State is not sincere, that it doesn't care about Islam. It's not a view that you seem to take, but it's something that you hear all the time, suggesting that they don't care about these things, they're not sincere, that they're cynical, that they're using Islam. I think it's maybe the other way around, actually, that it's not that the Islamic State is using Islam for its political ends, but it's using politics for religious ends.
Well, this is a whole nother discussion, but my view tends to be kind of reversed. I mean, I think the whole, religiously inspired violence tends to be as plausibly explained as being ultimately inspired by other things, even when people themselves think they're doing it in the name of God. I don't deny that, and I think we agree about that part. But this gets into something we only touched on in the conversation about kind of what is the more fundamental kind of determinant of the violence, and I would look elsewhere. I think they certainly do think of themselves as sincerely religious. I don't deny that, but I think they are. Well, I think human beings in general appropriate religion and ideology in the service of their own ends, and the question is, how did they come to have those ends and those motivations, and how did they come to need this for their self-esteem and so on? But it's a complicated question. I guess finally, I just want to give you a chance to complain about my criticism of your piece. Any other criticisms you want to complain about? I mean, there were plenty of them. Did you think there's a most fundamental misconception out there about the piece, or something like that?
There are definitely recurring tropes in the criticisms of the piece, and yeah, I suppose the most common one is to say that I was saying that ISIS is the inevitable outcome of Islam, and I think the piece itself is a pretty good rebuttal to that question. So that's where I would start. There have been some very intelligent replies to that I would encourage people to take a look at, and some of them are from Muslim scholars who are pointing out the specific ways in which ISIS is a discontinuity, a break from Islamic tradition. Some great stuff out there about that. And there are other Muslim scholars who have pointed out also, when we say that ISIS is not Islamic because we say it's not mainstream, that this is an interesting kind of exclusivity in the view of what Islam can be. So, I'm really glad actually at the kind of debate that it's occasioned, especially from Muslim scholars, but especially the ones who take seriously the idea that this is a descriptive attempt to show what ISIS actually wants and believes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks. What are you working on now, by the way?
More ISIS stuff, and I've got a nice murder mystery that I'll be writing soon for another magazine.
You're writing a murder mystery, a piece about an actual murder?
I'm writing about an actual murder, yeah.
I guess you can't say more. I'm intrigued.
Oh, me too. Me too. I hope it's good.
Okay. Well, I'll keep my eye out for that. Okay. Well, thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it, Graeme.
Thank you, Bob.
Okay. Take care.